Hello again everybody and welcome to another edition of On the Range, and today I'm going to feature another utility provided by a community member, and this one comes from the very active Italian DCS community, and it's a utility called Dcs Mission Planner by Rudder. And I'll have a link to the download in the video description, but let's go ahead and open it up and see what all it does for us. Now when you download and extract the file, you run the DCS MP program, and the interface comes up, and this is split into two sides. On the left side, you input information about your mission. You tell it what loadout you're taking up. You tell it a little bit about the runway you're taking off from, the weather conditions, the configuration you plan to take off and land in. You also tell it information about the mission that you're going to be flying, how far you're flying, how long you plan to be over the target. And what it does is it takes all that data and it gives you takeoff and landing data. Specifically, it gives you a refusal speed, which is the speed at which you can no longer safely abort the takeoff roll. It gives you a rotation speed, or the speed that you pull back on the stick and rotate to 10 degrees in the A10. And it gives you a distance for takeoff run. Now, for the mission data, based on what you input, it gives you the fuel required, the mission time and duration, and then landing data, it gives you an approach speed to fly, a landing speed, single engine approach speed, and a landing roll, among other things that we might look at here in a second. But let's go tab by tab, and we'll just do like a little hypothetical mission real quick. And we'll just say that we're going up in the A10, and we have put Mark 82s on 4, 5, 7, and 8. And let's go with just AGM-65s on 3 and 9. And let's look at on Station 10 a Lightning Pod. Station 2 we'll put a WOW 68. Say we have some Willie Pete or something out there in a rocket pod. Station 11, let's go with 2 IM-9s. Station 1, let's go with a 131 pod, why not? And for the Galway at 1150 rounds, that's a full gun load. And we'll say that we have 100% fuel loaded. So let's see what that gives us. Now for takeoff and landing on this tab, we'll say that we're taking off from a runway at 2,000 feet altitude, and we'll say that it's a pretty good runway. We'll go with a 10,000 foot runway. RCRs, the runway condition, we'll stay with 23. That's sort of a standard setting for a good dry runway, and I don't think that really matters in DCS, but we'll leave it there in either case. We can put in weather conditions. We'll just stay with the standard 2992, no wind, 20 degrees Celsius outside. The configuration, we'll just say that we're going to make a normal takeoff, 7 degrees flaps, max throttle. And let's pause there and see what all that gives us. Now, based on the loadout, it gives us an aircraft gross weight of 43,214 pounds. So a pretty heavy aircraft. Now, one other thing that I love that it gives us here, it gives us an asymmetric weight. So we have an imbalance of almost 3,000 pounds between the left wing and the right wing. So if we wanted to take that into account and go back and tweak our loadout, we could, but that's not an uncommon thing in the A10 to see, so we'll just leave it as is. And I actually have another video out there. It's on a basic A10 takeoff, and it discusses the effect of an asymmetric loadout on your takeoff run and aircraft performance, so I'll have a link to that as well. But the part that we were really going for there, okay, we have a refusal speed, which is calculated as greater than the rotation speed. So in this case, the refusal speed doesn't really matter. The rotation speed, however, is 133 knots. So that's the speed that, based on the loadout and the runway conditions, you would rotate at, and it gives us a takeoff run of 4,301 feet. So that's well within our hypothetical 10,000 foot runway. Now let's just say, for example, that we don't have 10,000 feet to work with, that we have a damaged runway, or we're just doing some short field operations. Let's see what happens when we go to 4,000 feet on the runway length. And you can see that, okay, for our takeoff run of 4,301, we no longer are able to take off in that length. So we would have to come back to our loadout and make some adjustments. We'll just, for example, say that, we'll just take internal only on the fuel load and see what that does for us. So takeoff run 3,549 feet. That's well within our 4,000 feet runway length, but you can see that the mission data is now highlighted in yellow. So that means that we have a little bit of work to do on the mission tab. Now let me finish out on this one, additional information that it gives us here. We've seen the refusal, rotation speed, takeoff run. We also have PTFS. This is the predicted turbine fan speed, and this is used as a kind of a cross-check during the takeoff roll to determine whether or not your engines are putting out the required performance. So very neat that that's included. But now we'll skip down to the landing. So it either takes the same information for the runway and the weather as you put in for the takeoff, or you can put in different information for a landing runway. We'll just leave it the same as takeoff and assume that we're flying out of the same field. But landing, We can configure flaps. We can say speed brakes open or closed. We'll just leave it in the standard 20-degree flaps, full open speed brakes. And it gives us an approach speed. And I'll come over here to the right side. Approach speed 129 knots, landing speed 119, single engine approach speed 151, landing roll 1620. So again, we're just fine for our hypothetical 4,000 foot runway. And you can see that this is neat to play with, and you can, I'm sure, understand the importance of this, especially if you're playing this more or less for real, where you're going from engine start to engine shutdown the way that I usually do it. So it just gives you a lot of good information right here. Now, I mentioned before that we have this yellow highlight under mission data for fuel required. So let's come over to the mission tab. And this allows us to do some very, very detailed fuel planning for the mission. So, for example, by default, it's set up to take off and climb to 18,000 feet at max throttle, cruise for 80 miles at 220 knots. It gives us 10 minutes of loader time over the target, 5 minutes of combat time at max throttle, another climb out back to 18,000 feet, cruise back to base of 80 miles at 220 knots, a descent and landing, and it's telling us that we start with 6,901 pounds of fuel, but to execute that mission, we need 6,678. We can make it, but just barely, so we want to do some planning here, and there are all kinds of options. You know, for example, if I wanted to ensure that I made it back to base with a couple of thousand pounds remaining, I could say, well, 80 miles isn't going to work. I need to hit a target, we'll say 20 nautical miles from the base. So I put 20 for the cruise, and that gives us fuel required 5352, which is well within the total fuel available, plus a little bit of a pad. But let's say, for example, that we absolutely have to go, say, 120 miles from base. Now that's going to give us fuel required 7561. We only take off with a 6901. So we have a little bit of work to do. Now we could try to adjust the cruise speed to make it a little bit more efficient. We could tweak the altitudes, or we might even have to just throw in there, I'll just say, okay, at some point after the cruise, I'm going to refuel. So I insert an action. I'll just say AAR, and I'll say that right here between the cruise and the loader at the target, I'm going to hit the tanker. I'll set aside, say, 10 minutes for that, 220 knots, and I'll say that after tanking, I'm going to have, we'll just say, I'll go ahead and top off to 8,000 pounds total on the aircraft, and you can see that that one aerial refueling inserted right there now says that the required fuel is 8,166, and after refueling, I'm going to be able to make it back to base just fine. In fact, I'm going to make it back to base with 4,836 pounds on the aircraft, so I probably don't even need to top off to a 8,000 pound load. I could just go for something like 7,000 and still be just fine. But, you know, there are infinite possibilities here and all kinds of things that you can plan around. You can even say, well, when I get into the combat phase, I plan on dropping, for example, we'll plan on expending 4 Mark 82s. We'll say that we plan on firing both AGM-65s, 1150 gun, and assuming that we expend everything, even with the aerial refueling, we come back with 4,069. Let's just, for example, say that, and I'm just playing around at this point because this is so neat. We'll just say, for example, that, okay, we don't refuel, so let me go ahead and remove this action. We expend munitions. What does that do for us on the return? Well, even at that point, we're still in better shape than we were to begin with, but we're still not in good shape. Let's go ahead and reduce this down to 80 miles. 80 and 80. Now we're getting back into the area where we're going to be able to make it back, but without much of a pad, and that's assuming we drop. Now, if I come back here and say, well, in that case, what if we don't expend? What's that going to do to our fuel efficiency? Don't expend, still going to make it back, but without much fuel as a pad. So you can see the possibilities that this opens up when it comes to planning. And, you know, you may be looking at this as a flight simmer and saying, well, I would never need to do that. I've never done that in the missions before, and I've never gone into this much detail in the planning for missions before, other than some takeoff and landing data, but it opens up so many possibilities. And my old boss, well, up until a couple of months ago, my old boss, old A-10 pilot, used to always say that for every hour of an A-10 mission, there was at least an hour of mission planning that went into it. figuring out the details like this. I mean, it's a pretty big deal to figure out if you're going to make it back to base or not, or figure out where and when you need to refuel. So this is I think a very, very great utility, and it makes a lot of these things that are kind of hard to do without a program to figure all this stuff out for you easy. So, you know, this is something that, as I'm planning missions, you know, I would be able to easily run the numbers through here, extract some data that I, in the past, would have had to have pulled out a calculator or gone to some charts to figure out, and, you know, get more of an experience and more enjoyment out of the experience that way than I otherwise would have been able to do. So, a very good utility. Check it out if this is something that looks like it's interesting to you, and I'll have a link to everything in the description. So I'll wrap this one up here. Thanks again, everybody, for watching, and I'll see you next time.